We now come to lesson 9 in our study of the life of Abraham, and the title of this lesson is The God Who Sees. We're going to look at a seemingly very insignificant person, that is, insignificant in the eyes of the world. She was a slave woman from Egypt, and her name is Hagar, and yet this slave woman became the object of God's very special love and provision, as we'll see. She was the maid of Abraham's wife, Sarah. So let me read this account to you from Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to do what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew that she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, that is, Hagar, began to despise Sarah. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah," she answered. And then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You're now with child, you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there today between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. One of the great temptations of our lives is to seek worldly solutions to spiritual issues. It's just very easy for Christians to compromise and to be so conditioned by the world that we begin to adopt its ways, its principles. And almost always when we do that, it leads to some kind of compromise in our spiritual values. And often it leads to negative consequences. We've talked before about sin and about choices and their consequences. Well, that's exactly what happened to Abram and Sarah. This is another one of those disappointing times in the life of Abram. I've told you before, he was a person just like we are. Yes, there were great times when he was a great man of faith. There were other times when he lacked significantly and he yielded to sinful things. And this is going to be one of those times that we see that. Well, let's see what the problem was. Sarah is still barren now in her old age, and by every human calculation, it was impossible for any child to come from her. And so what was she going to do? And I'm sure what was going through her head is, well, I know God made a promise, but maybe he wants us to help him out. Maybe we need to get involved in this. And it's interesting, though, first of all, that you need to see this, that actually Sarah blamed God for her barrenness. I mean, look at verse 2. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. It's always interesting that, let me tell you, when we stop trusting God, it's very easy to start blaming him or blaming other people for our difficulties. Well, Sarah thought about it. And she said to Abram, I'm going to give you my maid, Hagar, and you can take her, and hopefully we'll have a child by her. Now, what was that all about? Well, actually, it was a custom of the ancient Near East. If a couple couldn't have a child naturally, the wife could give one of her favorite servants to her husband. Now, that sounds ludicrous to us today. But let me say this, just because it was an accepted custom didn't make it right. And you know, that's true with us today. I mean, look, just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean that it makes it right for a Christian. And so now what happens with Abram? Now the man of faith became a man of unbelief. Instead of walking by faith, look, he'd been through this covenant ratification ceremony that God was going to do all these things. But instead of walking by faith, he now began to walk by sight, and he got in trouble in the process because Hagar conceived a child by Abram. Now you can just imagine what's going to happen here. Here's Hagar now with child and has Sarah, who's still barren, and you can always count on it that sin produces tension in relationships. And so what happened was this: when Hagar became pregnant, she began to despise Sarah. And actually, the word there meant looked with contempt upon her. I think the idea was that it was almost as though Hagar was saying, ha ha, Sarah, you couldn't have a child, but I'm the one who's got the child. Well, you can imagine the tension that came up. The situation not only caused tension between Hagar and Sarah, but it moved into the marriage. It came between Sarah and Abram. Remember, sin always produces tension. And often the effects of sin have multi-dimensional results to them. And so what happened now is Sarah began to blame Abraham. Now there were problems in the marriage. She said, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can find family. And so Abraham agreed. So after he had been living in the land for 10 years, Sarah took his wife and gave her. He slept with her and conceived. And when she saw she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarah said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. It's your problem. Kind of takes you back to Adam and Eve, where Adam began to blame Eve. Somebody's got to be blamed for the tension, for the problems. Well, Abram yielded to Sarah's frustration. And so he said to her, behold, your maid is in your hand. You do whatever you want to do with her. Now, what kind of leadership is that? Again, seeing great weakness in Abraham at this point. So Sarah took it up, and she treated Hagar harshly. And thus Hagar fled from her mistress. There was a wonderful commentary on this by Alan Ross. He said, the dark chain of Sarah's and Abraham's disobedience works to produce a complication from which emerge Hagar's pride and Sarah's harsh treatment. There's little difficulty in seeing what went wrong. Once the way of faith was abandoned and the way of human calculation was engaged, the family was caught up in a continuing chain of cause and effect that troubled them for ages. Once patient waiting was abandoned for human calculations, the natural impulses and right conduct became entangled. The participants had no control once this process was set into motion, for it led to conflict. Abram and Sarah should have waited patiently for the Lord. Well, an amazing thing happens, though. God intervenes. And you can imagine this pain that Hagar was going through. Put yourself in her place for a minute. Here was this young slave woman who had fled from her mistress. Now, when slaves ran from their mistresses or from their owners, there were severe consequences that followed. So she had put herself in great danger. But not only that, she was pregnant and all alone in the wilderness. She had no one to whom she could turn. In the eyes of the world, here's this very insignificant person who had nobody to care for her. But then an unexpected thing occurred. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was in the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? The angel of the Lord found her by this spring out in the wilderness. Now I want to show you something. God sought her. She wasn't seeking God. She was running away from everyone. But God came after her. So you see, God is more interested in us than we could ever be interested in ourselves. He loves us. He's concerned for us. And in this passage in Genesis 16:7 contains for the first time this mention in the Bible of the angel of the Lord. Now, let me just very quickly say, most Bible scholars agree that the angel of the Lord, like Melchizedek, was a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. In fact, if you look at verse 13, Hagar recognized him as God. Now, here's my point. God saw her distress, and he came after her. He found her. He went after her. And then he gives a revelation to her. He said, Sarah, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. I'm going to tell you that would not be an easy thing for Hagar to do. But often when we make bad decisions, we have to do everything we can to make it right. And we have to be willing to face whatever consequences are the result of our bad decisions. We have to face up to them. But then the angel of the Lord promised her that she would have many descendants. And he told Hagar that she would have a son and that she would name him Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. And by giving this name to Hagar's son, God was saying that he had heard the cry of the afflicted. It's interesting, Job 34:28 says, God hears the cry of the afflicted. And I think about all the afflicted people of the world, marginalized people of the world, people who are out there like a Hagar, seemingly insignificant. And yet God hears. God hears their cries. And so the angel of the Lord comes to her, and he gave a prophecy about her son. He said this, the descendants of Ishmael would be innumerable, but their destiny was going to be filled with tension and with strife. Well, let me remind you that Ishmael became the father of the Arab nations. And just look at the tension. Ever since this event and this prophecy of God to Hagar, there has been huge tension between the Jews and the Arabs all of these years. Well, Hagar responded after she heard this message. And this is what she said. She called the name of the Lord who spoke. Remember, I talked to you about the names of God, how important with this. There's a name here, and it's translated like this. Thou art a God who sees. Thou art a God who sees. And the name of the well, when translated, means the well of the living one who sees me. Now listen carefully. The God who had heard her was also the God who had first seen her. In her rebellion, God sought her out. Do you see this? What a picture of salvation this is. In Romans 3, verse 11, we're told there is none who seeks God. But what you see here is the story of the amazing love of God. Here is a God who sees, a God who hears, a God who comes after, a God who finds. And isn't that the essence of the gospel? Jesus Christ came after us. He came to rescue us. Oh, we were far away from him, but he didn't let us continue in our running. He comes after us, and he comes to deliver us, and he comes to redeem us. That is the heart of the gospel. And what you see here is the God of the gospel who goes after rebellious people. And in love, he hears them, he finds them, he redeems them, and he brings them back to himself. Well, Hagar obeyed God and later bore a son. And Abram called the name of his son Ishmael. Hagar went back a changed woman. I believe in my heart that she went back and told Abram and Sarah everything that had happened to her. Here's the good news from Hagar. No matter what the affliction is or how it came about, God sees and God hears, and God will come to our aid to rescue us.